Corsair reminds you to think safety first. Always remember, do not walk beneath the mast, and always check for overhead wires and other obstructions before raising or lowering the mast.
You are now about to experience the mast raising and launching of a Corsair 31 Trimaran. The basic steps are the same depending on which model you're working with, 24, 28, or 31. Everyone will end up rigging and setting their boat up a little bit different, but the basic procedure for mast raising is the same for all three models at this point since going to the rotating rig. We start by basically untying everything that is tying the boat down at this point, and then we'll start the process of raising, putting the gear together and raising the mast. These lines are here for transportation only, but the thing we'll do with them is once we untie them, we'll put them on attach them to the float and then use them as dock lines once we get the mast up and are ready to put the boat in the water. There's a U-bolt on the side of the float to attach the line to, and they want to be attached to the float, not to the main hull of the boat at this point, not to a bow cleat or a stern cleat, because when you go to fold the boat out, that'll keep the line attached to the float to the dock so the boat can move away from the dock at that point. These are just set on the side of the float at this point, and we'll get the line from the other side now and bring it across. The other tie-down line is then put on a U-bolt on the front part of the float bow. We're now going to take the trailer winch line, detach it from the boat. There's still a tie-down line for trailering from the boat to the trailer, which you want to leave during this process until we're ready to launch. But we're going to uncoil enough trailer winch line and set it up on deck. You'll need to unravel about 2/3 of the line on the spool at this point for mast raising. A good thing to do at this point is when you first get your boat new and do it the first time, you can actually mark the trailer line itself where that point is, and that eliminates the problem of having to get on and off the boat if you're doing this by yourself. The line is run up over a little roller which is offset to the side of the main forestay chain plate. And that's the part that guides it up. At this point, we're up on the boat, and starting from the front of the boat, we'll untie all the tie-down lines for trailering. As is the case in most things, there's more than one way to skin a cat, just as there's more than one way to tie your boat down and for trailering. There are three basic tie-down points where the mast rests in the mast cradle at the pulpit, at the spreaders, and where the mast rests in the aft mast support. These yellow tie wraps were put on here to keep the halyards from slapping on the mast and rubbing in transit. It's also not uncommon to what we call sky the halyards for transportation, which is basically pulling them all up to the sheave boxes as you see with the screecher and the spinnaker. And if that's the case and you've done that, then at this point you would need to pull them down to the base of the mast prior to raising the mast. We're almost ready to roll the mast back in place for mast raising. First thing we need to do prior to that is get the cap shrouds off the mast and down to the side of the boat. At this point, they're either coiled up and hooked onto the mast or if it's been a long trip or a long transport, they sometimes will be completely taken off the mast, which at this point you would have to reattach them to the mast up at the side here. So drop the one side off and then off to the other side. And then at this point, if you didn't have the assistance of someone else to come down or to hook these up, you'd have to come down off the front of the boat and hook the cap shrouds on to the chain plates on the floats. Once the circlip is taken from the clevis pin, the high field lever is attached to the chain plate at this point. Bungee cords have been attached to the uphaul and downhaul line for the dagger board and are now hooked to the high field lever itself, which is in the open position. Without that bungee cord, the lever has the ability to get sideways like this, and therefore when you get the mast to a certain point, it'll pull very hard from one side. If you forget the bungee cord, always remember that at the point of mast raising, when anything gets difficult, you need to stop, look around, and make sure everything's as it should be. The wire is then put up around the winch, which once again helps to keep things clear of the boat and all its parts as the wires are coming up. I'll now go around to the other side and hook that high field lever up and cap shroud as well. Once the cap shrouds are hooked up, you're ready to go back up on the boat, once again if you're by yourself. Prior to rolling the mast back in place to be prepared for the mast raising, the mast raising yoke is placed in position with two pins going into the deck hinges on the deck. It's then sat down, and the pin, which is hooked through the mast raising yoke, and the mast base itself, once rolled back, should be set aside and ready to be put in. Make sure all the lines are untied prior to rolling the mast back, and then we're ready to roll. At this point, if you've got a 31 with an aluminum rig, the spreaders are a little wider than the space between the aft beams. So at this point, a little twisting motion is necessary to get it past that point and take it back aft to the point of being able to raise the yoke up and pin it at this point. Once pinned, the mast is secure and won't move. The mast raising wires and the mast raising pole are the next things to go in place. The pole is inserted in the yoke with the eye strap facing forward. The hook is released and it is then pulled into place and latched onto the attachment point on the mast. The mast raising wires are uncoiled, attached to that same spot on the mast separated and attached to the mast raising loops on the deck of the boat. With these in place, you're now ready for the trailer winch line, which has already been put on deck, and the mast raising cradle can be removed at this point and set on the deck. The mast raising line is thrown over the end of the yoke, and then the jib halyard is hooked to that. The jib halyard is hooked to the trailer winch line through the bowline in the end of the line, not through the metal hook on the trailer winch line. Be sure the snap shackle is locked back into place. The jib halyard is then pulled tight and cinched to the cleat located on the starboard side of the mast. At this point, be sure that all lines are clear and free of the mast base itself. And we're ready to raise the mast. If you have two people, generally one person will stand on the deck and monitor the mast raising wires for tightness, and as well just watch to make sure that all lines are clear as it's coming up. But it's not necessary the way the system is set up. At this point, you begin to raise the mast. The winch on the trailer itself has a centrifugal clutch that will not allow itself to back off once you take your hand off the crank, but it's a good idea to keep your hand on it at all times unless you absolutely have to leave it. One thing that needs to be noted at this point is that because the roller that the line runs through is offset from the side of the chain plate, you need to be sure that the line is spooling straight onto the winch spool itself. A slight tug on the line is sometimes necessary. When you're almost in the vertical position, you need to be sure that the mast base is contacting on the ball itself. Once the mast raising wires or the cap shrouds become tight, you're pretty much in the vertical position, and at this point you can go back on deck and hook up the forestay to the chain plate. Some boats will have roller furling, some will have just standard forestays with hank-on jibs, so every boat's a little bit different. Once the forestay is hooked up, the tension can be released on the trailer winch line and the jib halyard unhooked. At this point, I release it from the cleat on the mast and hook it to the pulpit for when we're ready to put the jib on. And the mast raising pole can be removed at this time. Once the gear is stowed in the truck, mast raising pole, mast raising yoke, and the line restored to the trailer winch, we're ready to untie the line from the bow and launch the boat. this point, you take the topping lift, remove it from the mast, bring it back and attach it to the aft of the boom. Hook up the main sheet to the opposite end of where the topping lift went, and at this point you're ready to move the mainsail and boom back into place and insert it in the mast. With the boom inserted in the mast, the roller furling crank handle is then attached to the front of the mast. Once the mast is up, the halyards are then led through the turning blocks at the base of the mast and through their respective deck organizer sheave and back to the clutches. We're now ready to unfold the boat and tension up the cap shrouds. To unfold, there's a pin that connects the beam to the main hole for trailering. The pin is removed and you're ready to unfold. It's easier to unfold the dock side first if you happen to be attached to a dock. If not, and you're on the water, either side will do. It's a little hard at first because at this point you're pushing the dock and the boat all at the same time. At this point you step on the beam and tighten up the nut on the beam end. You do this forward and aft. You screw the beam bolt in until finger tight. And then a speed wrench provided with the boat to snug it down to just snug, not over tight. The step is then repeated on the other side of using the same procedure. Once the beam bolts are snug, the high field levers are tensioned up, first one side, then the other. Once the high field levers are tensioned up, the mast raising wires can be removed at this point. With the mast raising wires off, the boat is now launched, mast up, ready to go sailing. You've now pretty much experienced the mast raising and launching of a Corsair 31, and after a bit of practice, an owner should be capable of doing this in 30 minutes or less. The mast lowering process is basically a reversal of the raising process. With the trailer winch line hooked to the jib halyard, take up the tension on the halyard itself, tie it back off to the cleat as we did in the raising process. We'll need some tension on the trailer line to be able to release the forestay. which in the case that you've only got one person doing this, can be done fairly easily from the ground at this point. As in the case of mast raising, you want to make sure that there's no one behind the boat at this point and that all's clear. Two critical points on this is one, to make sure that the rope is guided into the mast, into the roller on the side of the chain plate on the bow. And then the most critical part of lowering is that the trailer winch line jib halyard combination lands in the fork of the mast raising pole, which creates the fulcrum that we need to be able to do this. The final critical part of the mast lowering process is that the mast itself lands squarely in the center of the aft mast support roller. As the mast gets close to the aft mast support in the roller, just a slight tug hanging onto the mast diamond wire and the mast raising wire can manipulate the mast into the place where you want it, which is in the center of the roller. Once down, the trailer winch line tension can be released and things unhooked. And at this point, we'd roll the mast back into the forward place once removing the mast raising gear. And by straddling the mast will be held into place as you release the pin holding the yoke to the mast base itself. Moving back and getting a firm grip on the diamond wires themselves, and we're ready to roll the mast back forward. Once again, as the mast reaches the point of the aft beams, the spreaders will need to be tilted to the side slightly to pass through that area. Once the mast is back in the cradle, go through the process of tying down the mast as it was when you started out, and you're done.